my name's Lieutenant General Richard Nugee, a long-time soldier, and I finished my time in the military by writing the Climate Change and Sustainability Report for the Ministry of Defence, explaining why the Ministry of Defence should pay attention to climate change. And since then, I have done a number of talks and articles around the world talking about why militaries, but more importantly, why national security is affected by climate change. I became interested in the military at the age of 14. I actually joined when I was 16, all down to my grandfather. My grandfather was a soldier in the First World War and the Second World War. He spanned both world wars. And he was an officer. And he turned around to me just before he died, 3 days before he died, in the 70s. And he said, there is no greater privilege in the world than being with and commanding soldiers. And so I thought I'd give it a go. And I sort of stayed with it because I really enjoyed it, and it was a very worthwhile career.
What led you to, sorry, I just want to do a double check on that all looked fine. In the issue of climate change?
So I read anthropology at university. So in the early 80s, anthropology was really limited to what was called social anthropology and physical anthropology. And physical anthropology, I was much more interested in many respects, was the study of how the environment shaped mankind as it is today. Now, there's been a huge amount more information about anthropology and about how man was formed and why the human race was formed in the way that it is, but it's always fascinated me. Climate change, of course, is just the other side of the coin. It's how humans are shaping the environment as opposed to how they were shaped by the environment. So I've been interested in that all my life. It's something that I've been sort of reading about, how societies and how civilizations have improved or have failed as a result of the environment.
What was the convergence between your military career and the awareness of potential effects of climate?
So 2003, I was what was called the follow-on force after the invasion of Iraq. So I didn't actually do the invasion, which was early 2003. I turned up sort of late spring 2003 with a battle group of 1,000 soldiers, with small tanks, with artillery, with infantry, with engineers, a full sort of mini force, all on my own, and I commanded, if you like, the real estate of everything south of Basra in southern Iraq. For 2 weeks of the year, the wind changes direction. So for the vast majority of the year, the wind comes from the north. And it is hot, but it's very, very dry. It comes down Iraq, which is basically a very dry country apart from the Euphrates and the Tigris. And so you have a very dry wind. And heat in dry conditions is bearable. I mean, it's hot and you have to drink lots, but it's bearable. And after we'd acclimatized, that's fine. For 2 weeks of the year, the Iraqis call it, and I can't remember the name in Arabic, but the Iraqis call it the cooker. And for 2 weeks of the year, the wind backs and it comes off the Gulf. And so for 2 weeks, you've got huge amounts of humidity and 50 degrees of heat. And that, when I assessed of how many soldiers died as a result of enemy action in my time in Iraq, of my soldiers, the answer was 0. How many soldiers died as a result of the heat? 1. How many soldiers were sent back to the UK with heat stroke? 5. How many soldiers had to recover in hospital with a saline drip to keep them alive? About 250. So out of 1,000 over the 6 odd months. So for me, understanding that fighting of being an effective military force in an environment which was utterly hostile from heat and humidity in this case, led me to believe and led me to look at why was it, or how, no, not why, but how were we going to be able to operate in those conditions in the future? Because if climate change is right and we are getting hotter and hotter, and every scientist sort of suggests that, then the reality is that we're going to have to be able to fight in those environments. Otherwise, we're not a worthwhile force, and we need to know what it's going to look like. That's when the two came together.
So the light went on, I guess, as it were. What were your first steps with that? You must have been thinking, so how am I going to articulate my concerns about this and translate that into some kind of...
So it took time. It took time for me to understand more about climate change, what was actually happening. This was early, this was 2003. It took time to be in a position to be able to do anything about it. And the posts that I was in did not lend itself to being in an influential enough position to be able to do anything about it. So you could criticize that I didn't immediately become a sort of a evangelist for climate change within defence. But a single person not in a position of responsibility and not in a position to influence is not going to have any effect. So I waited my time till I had some influence, and I was on the executive committee of defence. It's the, if you like, it was the level just below ministers that the Ministry of Defence actually operates at. It's executive rather than ministerial. And I was on that committee for 4 years, and in those 4 years, climate change and sustainability were not mentioned once. And so I turned around and said, I must do something about it because nobody else is doing anything about it, despite the fact that we were on, by that stage, COP24, COP25, we'd had the Paris Agreement. In other words, the rest of the world was waking up to this, and the Ministry of Defence was not even noticing it. And so I took the opportunity when I got the chance to write a report that changed the way the Ministry of Defence thought about climate change to take it seriously. And it would have had no effect if I'd been more junior, if I hadn't been respected as one of the executive committee, if I hadn't had that opportunity. It would have been a flash in the pan and somebody would have said, oh, poor man, get on without him. But because I was in a position of authority and responsibility and influence, it actually had an effect. And that is something that was quite useful.
What was that initial, Hollywood pitch? What was that initial short statement? How did it start to evolve?
so I had to. I was finishing my job, and my successor had been appointed, and I said, "Look, I'll go early if you allow me to write a report on climate change." And my successor will come in, and of course that will be a good thing because you're always looking forward to the successor, especially if you've been in a job for 4 years. The next person's always more interesting, regardless of how good you are. They're always more excited about the new person. So I said, well, I'll take advantage of this, and I'll go early. And they said, well, you can go early, but we really don't want this report. I mean, it's pointless. Two people turned around to me and said, we're exempt climate change. And the first time I didn't have an answer for that, but the second time I said, what, so you're exempt from the world, are you? Because it's happening around you, whether you like it or not. It's not something that you choose to accept climate change is happening or not. So I wrote the report against their initial wishes. But the really important thing I realised very quickly, I focused the whole thing, if you like, on the Secretary of State and on the Finance Director to say what is going to make them think about climate change? What is going to make them sit up and notice? And the Ministry of Defence, like all ministries of defence around the world, are relatively conservative with a small c, relatively status quo is okay, because what they don't want is violent eruptions which lead to conflict. It is an interesting aside. It's unlike the Americans have just gone, it's a Ministry of Defence. We're there to defend, we're not there to attack, we're not there to go to war unless we are forced to do so. And so, from my perspective, what I wanted to do was look for what would really make the Ministry of Defence sit up. And there's two things the Ministry of Defence, the UK Ministry of Defence, but I'd say it's the same across the world, are really interested in. One is increasing the capability of our troops so that they are better than the opposition. That's what we're striving for all the time. There's no point in going to war if you're going to lose. Nobody goes to war, nobody goes into battle thinking they're going to lose if it is their choice. They always think they're going to come out on top. And therefore, you need to be better than your opposition. The second piece was the Ministry of Defence is always short of money. It is by de facto, it is always going to be short of money. Even the US Defence, or Department of War as it is now, is short of money. Why? Because you can never have enough. Because actually, you need stockpiles to be able to fight a war that might last a year or 2 years. If you only have a stockpile that lasts a week or 2 weeks, then you do not have enough. And it causes lots more problems. So you're always after more. That is a factor of being in the risk business. You want to guarantee and guarantee and guarantee. So I looked for ways of presenting climate change as an opportunity to increase our capability and to save money. And in that way, people sat up and noticed. If I had said, we want to do this to save the planet, they would have turned around and said, it's not our job. Our job is to defend this nation. The two are different.
I noticed that I watched Henry, the movie Henry again recently, and Agincourt was won, according to the movie, in part because of the longbow strategy, but also the state of the field and the mud and getting trapped. And of course, the Russians weren't doing too well in terms of the melting frost. And I was also up in the subarctic circle with the US Army Corps of Engineers who were working on permafrost questions there where it's melting. Are there any of those kind of elements that come into it, or the melting of the Northwest Passage? I mean, there's so many kind of military.
So there's lots going on, first of all, armies, particularly armies, but armies have always been subject to the environment in which they're operating. Napoleon came back with very few troops from Moscow because he lost so many to the cold. General Winter, he called it, because General Winter was his biggest enemy, not the Russians. You've had untold numbers of campaigns that have got bogged down or stopped because of the environment. It is a little-known fact, and one that I find quite surprising, that the greatest loss of life that the Royal Navy has ever suffered on a single day was not a battle, but was a storm in the 1700s, which wiped out half the fleet. And that was the largest loss of life that Britain's Royal Navy has ever suffered on a single day. So even in the Navy, it is an issue, but here's the rub. We have got used to an environment that we understand. We know what the limits are, or we knew what the limits are. And we knew that temperatures never got much above 40 degrees. We knew that you could operate in surface sea temperatures that were on average around about 15 to 20 degrees maximum. Now the world's changed. And so those environmental parameters against which our equipment is based and against which we are used to fighting are changing. We're getting much hotter environments for the army. We're getting much hotter surface sea temperatures with the... Are you recording it?
Yeah, I just started.
And so the army... sorry, had I done the army bits? The Napoleon... Or not? General Winter.
General Winter, you just started that. Maybe start that again.
Okay. So the army is also used to different environments. So countless strategies and plans have been bogged down due to weather. Napoleon lost huge numbers of the Grand Army to what he called a general winter, just the cold and the frost coming out of Moscow, far more than he lost to the Russian troops. So we're used to that. But it's changing. And that's the point. The envelopes within which we have been operating for 1,000 years are changing. And so they're becoming more extreme. And you've got more extreme storms. You've got more extreme heat for troops to operate in. And the UK Met Office has said that the Gulf environment, the surface sea temperature by 2040 could be about 38 degrees. Now, all ships pretty much use surface sea temperature or surface water to cool engines. You see it all the time. And water goes in, it flows around the engine and goes out again hot, and it has cooled the engine. You can't cool engines if it's at 38 degrees. In fact, it acts as a thermal blanket, and so the engines just cut out. And so we need to understand how it's going to change and adapt our equipment and adapt our tactics and our procedures in order to be able to cope with it.
So you've moved on to another really important. There's two things I want to talk about. One is when weather issues become social issues, become military issues. But I just want to talk about the AMOC because that's leading into that. Because the change in surface temperature is meaning that we could only be a few years away from extreme weather that's going to create all kind of social challenges that are also military challenges. Can you just give some brief thoughts on that?
So I think there is an element of national security to all of this. What is national security? To my mind, you'll find lots of definitions in Wikipedia and other places, but to my mind, national security is allowing a country, and it varies by country, to live the way they wish to lead. Now, in a democracy, it's to live the way that we elect people. The people choose to live. In a dictatorship, it is the way that the leadership want the country to live. But it is to allow the country to live the way they want to live. Climate change has a real chance of damaging that. Why? Because the way we want to live is not possible if you have a huge issue over food security, if you have a huge issue over water security, if you have unbounded migration, if you have opportunities of diseases to come in, if you have, for example, parts of your country that cannot be insured because they are so subject to the effect of violence through climate change. So when does that become a military problem? It becomes a military problem when people take to the streets and the police can't cope. I really hope we never get there, but it is an issue where the military are being called on to deal with floods, called on to reinforce dams, called on to rebuild things that have been damaged. Why? Because the military are a formed body of disciplined people who will follow orders to do things that others can't do in quantity. And therefore the military get involved in disaster relief, the military get involved in keeping our streets safe, if necessary, and I hope it's not necessary. And therefore the military need to understand what the possibilities of that are in order to preserve our national security.
We do have just a slight variance on that, and just thought you may not agree with it at all, but if you look at things like Israel and the Bekaa Valley and places like that, the security around water and other resources that have moulded a lot of the things that they've done. If the UK is only growing about 62% of its own food, I think, and it relies on other places to do that, is that also a potential challenge that would have to be addressed?
Yeah, depending on on what it is, we grow anywhere between 40 and 60% of our own food. We haven't been able to feed ourselves as a country for over 200 years. Famously, Churchill was most worried about running out of food during the Second World War, and that's why he was absolutely adamant we had to win the Battle of the Atlantic in order to be able to get food from the rest of the world into Britain in order to be able to feed the population, because we haven't been able to feed our population for a very long time. What's the effect of climate change? Climate change is increasing the cost of food dramatically. A lot of the cost of living crisis is down to the effects of climate change on where we get our food. We've got an increase in shoplifting. A lot of that shoplifting, as I understand it, is food. Why? Because people can't afford it in the cost of living crisis. So it's growing crime waves as well. In terms of shoplifting. And so what you're getting is a more fragile society, teetering on the edge of fragility of people following the rule of law because they can't afford to live the life they wish to live. And that becomes a political problem, it becomes a security problem, that actually people are more likely to take to the streets than not, and more likely to be violent if they cannot see a way through doing it through the rule of law. And climate is just piling on the pressure on our food. And if the AMOC does fail, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation fails, we should never forget that Scotland is on a latitude the same as Alaska. New York, which is much further south than the whole of Great Britain and the United Kingdom, has much more severe winters than we do. So we would be suffering severe winters if that circulation fails, in a way that would probably prohibit us growing much food at all. And that would just make the matter much, much worse.
Literally just about at the end here. Going back to the military, what are, you talked about being self-sufficient from an energy point of view with solar. Are there any other things that you're a proponent of in the military in terms of protecting against climate change?
So providing our own energy is a really important piece, not least because in Afghanistan, in a contested environment, and Iraq, the US military lost 2,000 to 3,000 soldiers on logistic resupply patrols for fuel. The British lost their most senior officer in Afghanistan on a logistic resupply for fuel. So it has a material effect on lives. It has a material effect on just getting fuel there in terms of our equipment, cost in terms of money, cost in terms of blood, if you like, and cost in terms of, if we hadn't had to do that, we could instead be using the tanks and the helicopters and all the rest of it to defend ourselves rather than just defend our fuel. So it's a really important piece. We're looking, the Ministry of Defence is looking with Rolls-Royce at Pico Nuclear, where you could have a very, very small nuclear reactor in a 40-foot container, which could be deployed on a truck, which then could produce all the energy for a base, an overseas base. But it's more than that. It's looking at our materials. It's looking at, we're building now net zero buildings as accommodation, new accommodation buildings where it is better, both in terms of insulation and in terms of heating and et cetera, and it costs nothing to run. We're looking in terms of electric vehicles, electric drives on our vehicles, not 100% electric. Nobody, I think, in their right mind would believe that that's good on a battlefield, but why not, and this is what we're looking at, hybrid drives, where actually it's an electric drive system which takes out all the mechanics, but has a backup of an engine to keep the battery topped up. It's those sorts of things that provide better outcomes for our people in a more electrified world than just sticking with what we've always done before.
Last question. How do you feel personally about the way things are going? Understanding human nature. I mean, what the path that you took to achieve your objectives, know that if you just said we need to do the right thing, it's not enough. How do you feel about the future personally, where we're going?
So there's two sides to this. I'm a born optimist, and one side is a born optimist will believe there's a sort of an optimist will believe that there is, if you like, success at the end of the tunnel, or light at the end of the tunnel. And I would say that as a soldier, I'm pragmatic. So I'm a sort of pragmatic optimist, I would say. So I would say that when we get to a better place, it will be much better, not just cheaper. It'll be better for pollution. It'll be better for the environment, and it'll also there'll be more biodiversity, but it'll also be better in terms of energy. And that, of course, is the if you like, the absolute goal of something like nuclear fusion, where actually you have unlimited energy. So I'm an optimist that we can get there. We can get there because I believe that we will find a way through with technology. But technology in itself is not enough. What we need to do is reach a tipping point with people that they genuinely start to change the way they run their lives. That only comes, and this is perhaps the pragmatic side of it, most people respond to incentives. And so we have the ability to incentivize people to go the right way. We have the ability to stop doing that as well. And I am absolutely sure that when policymakers finally realize exactly what is happening, and I hope we've done our bit to try and help that they will start to incentivize the right behaviors rather than the wrong behaviors, because people do ultimately pay attention to incentives because they want the best for them and the best for their children. And that comes about through incentives. So there's an awful long way to go in making sure that the incentivization that the country has is in the right direction. And it's not seen as a burden, but seen as a benefit. But if we can do it, I'm completely optimistic that we will get there. We'll go through some harder times, I have no doubt at all. But the whole way through my military career, you have to do the hard bit to get to the if you like, the easy bit afterwards.